Imagine you're a child in Victorian London. Outside, the floodwaters rise to your knees. You clutch a loaf of bread above your head, praying it stays dry. Around you, neighbors wade through sewage just to survive another day. The water is black foul, alive with rats and rubbish. And yet, it's the only water your family has left to drink. Every storm turns the city into a trap. Streets vanish beneath waves of sewage. Homes buckle as the Thames swells. The rich retreat to their tall houses, while the poor drown in basements and cellars. And with every flood comes disease, cholera, typhoid, dysentery, spreading silently through every cup and every mouthful. Parents face cruel choices: let their children go thirsty, or risk poisoning them with water that looks clear but carries death. Some boil it in dented pots, others turn to beer instead because at least beer won't kill you so quickly. This was life in the world's richest city, a capital of empire draped in grandeur above, but flooded with filth below. So how did Londoners survive it? How did they endure year after year of floods, dirty water and disease, when their very city seemed determined to drown them? To answer that, we first need to understand why London flooded so often in the first place. It wasn't a single freak disaster. It was the geography, the climate, and the failures of a rapidly growing city, all conspiring against its people. The River Thames was both London's lifeline and its curse. As a tidal river, it rose and fell twice each day with the pull of the sea. When storms swept in from the North Sea, the tide would push back along the Thames, swelling it beyond its banks and driving water into the streets. But geography alone did not explain the misery. By the mid-19th century, London was the largest city in the world, overcrowded, poorly planned, and unprepared for the natural pressures it faced. Low-lying districts, particularly in the East End and along the docks, were especially vulnerable. A heavy downpour or tidal surge could quickly submerge entire neighborhoods. The city's drainage system only made matters worse. London relied on a patchwork of open ditches, overflowing cesspits, and primitive drains. When rain came, they were overwhelmed. Human waste, animal carcasses, and industrial refuse poured directly into the river, creating a toxic brew that spread wherever the floodwater reached. These floods were not rare accidents, they were recurring torments. In 1877, large areas of Battersea and Lambeth vanished beneath water. In 1881, homes in Southwark and Bermondsey were inundated, their basements filling like wells. The following year, in 1882, floods devastated the East End, forcing families to flee as their fragile homes collapsed under damp and rot. For the wealthy, floods were a nuisance read about in newspapers. For the poor, they were a seasonal reality. Each tide and storm threatened to wash away homes, possessions, and lives. London, the pride of an empire, was built on a river that could drown its own people at any moment. Floodwater alone was deadly, but the deeper crisis lay in what Londoners were forced to drink. Safe drinking water was scarce, and for the poor it was almost non-existent. Wells that once sustained neighborhoods had become contaminated as the city expanded. Their wooden linings rotted, their underground reservoirs leaked into cesspits, and water that once ran clear turned foul, carrying a greasy film and a stench of decay. The Thames itself was no solution. By the Victorian period, it had become both a sewer and water supply. Factories discharged chemical waste. Slaughterhouses dumped blood and offal. Human sewage flowed unchecked. Yet many households had no choice but to draw their drinking water directly from this river, knowing it carried the very diseases that ravaged their communities. Those who could afford alternatives turned to substitutes. Weak small beer was consumed daily because the brewing process killed some of the germs. Gin, dangerously cheap and plentiful, offered escape but caused devastation of its own. Weak tea became another fallback, its boiling thought to make water safer. Rainwater was collected in barrels, sometimes strained through cloth or charcoal. These methods offered hope, but none could guarantee safety. The risk was constant. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery struck repeatedly, with major outbreaks in 1832, 1848, 1854, and 1866. Tens of thousands died, many from nothing more than a sip of contaminated water. To live in flooded London was to face an impossible choice: risk thirst or risk death. Survival was measured in cups, mugs, and pitchers, each filled with danger. But water was not only a threat when it was swallowed. It invaded walls, soaked through floors, and destroyed the very spaces people called home. When floods struck Victorian London, families faced the almost impossible task of defending their homes and meagre possessions. Housing for the poor was already fragile. Rows of cheaply built tenements, wooden floors and cellars that doubled as sleeping spaces. Once the waters rose, these structures became dangerously vulnerable. The first line of defense was at the doorstep. Residents laid planks or hammered boards across doorframes, hoping to block the water. Some filled sacks with ashes or soil to create makeshift barriers. But these efforts rarely lasted long. Floodwater seeped through brickwork, slipped beneath floorboards and crept up walls. Inside, the battle shifted to saving what little people owned. Furniture was raised on bricks or barrels. Mattresses and bedding were dragged upstairs, often crammed into tiny attics where whole families ended up sleeping. Small livestock, chickens, goats, and even pigs, were sometimes brought inside or moved upstairs, adding to the overcrowding. Yet despite these efforts, most homes suffered. Constant damp rotted wooden beams and warped floors. Wallpaper peeled away, plaster fell in chunks, and the smell of sewage lingered for weeks. Poorly built houses often collapsed after repeated flooding, leaving families homeless and penniless. For the poorest Londoners, there was no insurance, no safety net, and no compensation. Each flood stripped away possessions and savings, forcing them to start again. To survive was not to stop the water. It was to endure the damage and rebuild, knowing the next flood was never far away. Flooding in Victorian London did not only destroy homes, it disrupted food supplies, threatening survival at the most basic level. The city's poor, who lived hand-to-mouth on fragile wages, felt this burden most severely. When water swallowed the streets, bakeries struggled to keep ovens lit and deliveries stalled. Bread, the staple of most households, quickly grew scarce. In flooded neighborhoods, loaves became too expensive for working families, and in some cases impossible to find at all. Grain soaked in warehouses spoiled, sending prices even higher. Markets, usually the lifeblood of poor communities, turned chaotic. Floodwater seeped into stalls and carts, spoiling fruit, vegetables, and meat. Traders tried to adapt by raising carts on stilts or balancing goods on crates to keep them dry. Still, much of the produce was ruined, rotting in the damp air before it could be sold. The smell of spoiled food mingled with sewage, turning marketplaces into scenes of filth and desperation. Street hawkers, who sold cheap goods door to door, waded waist-deep through water to reach customers. Some carried coal, others fish or fruit, balancing baskets above the flood. For families with no access to shops, these sellers were often the only source of supplies, but their goods too were often damp, damaged, or dangerously contaminated. For the poorest children and scavengers, floodwaters became a grim opportunity. Known as mudlarks, they picked through debris along the Thames or retrieved spoiled vegetables and scraps from markets to sell or eat. Flooding only increased this desperate trade. As more waste and ruin washed into the streets, every flood threatened famine for the working poor. Even when food was available, contamination was a constant fear. Meat soaked in floodwater could carry disease, fruit could rot in hours, and bread once wet quickly grew mold. Families were forced to make impossible choices, go hungry or risk illness from what little remained. The floods of Victorian London were more than rising water. They struck at the very heart of survival, turning every meal into a gamble and every market into a place of danger. And, if the rising water was terrifying, what lay hidden beneath its surface was worse. Floods in Victorian London were never just rainwater. They were a poisonous mixture of sewage, industrial waste, and disease. Every flood stirred the contents of thousands of overflowing cesspits and drains. Human waste, already choking the city's alleys and gutters, spread through homes, markets, and cellars. The stench was overwhelming, and Victorians believed in the deadly power of miasma, the poisonous air they thought carried disease. While the true killers were microscopic germs, the fear of foul smells reflected a grim reality. Wherever the stench lingered, sickness followed. Rats thrived in these conditions. Driven from sewers by rising water, they infested homes, carrying fleas and parasites that spread through the poorest districts. Flea bites, lice infestations, and contaminated food added to the cycle of misery. Floodwaters also swept through slaughterhouses and tanneries, spreading animal remains and chemicals, making every street a hazard. The greatest danger, however, came in the form of epidemics. Cholera was the most feared. Outbreaks struck in 1832, 1848, 1854, and 1866, killing tens of thousands in terrifying waves. Victims could perish within hours of drinking tainted water, their bodies drained by violent illness. Typhoid and dysentery followed closely behind, striking families weakened by hunger and cold. Even the dead were not safe. In low-lying areas, flooded cemeteries released coffins, bones, and corpses into the water. Parish officials often resorted to sprinkling quicklime over burial grounds in an attempt to suppress both stench and contagion. But these measures did little to reassure the living. To wade through a flooded London street was to enter a world where every step, every mouthful, and every breath carried danger. Floodwaters were not simply an inconvenience, they were a lethal force, carrying with them the city's own hidden horrors. For Londoners, floods did not stop daily life. Work had to continue, food had to be found, and wages had to be earned. Yet moving through a drowned city was as dangerous as it was exhausting. In many neighborhoods, makeshift wooden planks were laid from doorway to doorway, forming narrow walkways just above the water. They were slippery and unstable, but without them, residents risked wading waist-deep through sewage. Children and the elderly often slipped from these planks, plunging into contaminated water that could infect them with a single mouthful. Where the streets were completely submerged, boats became the only reliable transport. Small ferries carried passengers across what had once been busy roads. Enterprising watermen charged a few pennies for passage, rowing between shopfronts and flooded alleyways. But for the poorest, even this was too expensive. Most Londoners had no choice but to walk. They tied up skirts, rolled trousers, and stepped barefoot into the filthy water. Boots quickly rotted in the damp, and wooden clogs offered little protection. Some carried bundles and baskets on their heads to keep them dry. Children floated on doors or barrels, turning survival into crude play. Crossing the city became a test of endurance. Workers trudged through miles of flooded streets to reach factories and docks, because missing a single day's wage meant hunger. Women carried laundry or baskets of food above their heads, balancing carefully as they made their way across planks or through knee-deep filth. The image of London, as the capital of the world, the glittering heart of an empire, stood in stark contrast to these scenes. Beneath the wealth and grandeur, its people navigated their daily lives like castaways in their own city, forced to adapt to water that never seemed to retreat for long, and yet no one truly survived the floods alone. When the waters rose, it was not just individual endurance but the bonds of community, charity, and faith that carried people through. When streets vanished beneath water and food or coal ran short, neighbors looked to one another for help. Families shared scraps of bread or offered a corner of an upstairs room to those whose homes had collapsed under the damp. In the poorest districts, this sense of mutual aid was often the only safety net available. Churches became vital anchors in times of crisis. Parish halls opened as makeshift shelters, offering blankets and warm soup to families who had lost everything to the floodwaters. Clergymen and volunteers delivered coal, loaves of bread, and second-hand clothing to those trapped in submerged courts and alleys. For many, this was the difference between enduring the night and freezing in damp, unheated rooms. Charitable societies also played a role, though their reach was limited. Wealthy benefactors sometimes donated money for relief, funding soup kitchens or distributing food tickets among the poor. Yet charity was not always dependable. Relief efforts were sporadic, often overwhelmed by the scale of need, and many families still went hungry. Amid the desperation, faith offered another form of endurance. Floods were frequently interpreted as divine punishment, a reminder of sin and human weakness. Prayer meetings multiplied during periods of disaster, with sermons urging repentance and patience. For the destitute, this spiritual framework gave meaning to suffering that might otherwise have felt unbearable. Others turned to superstition, placing charms by doorways or sprinkling salt to ward off disease and misfortune. The resilience of London's working classes was tested constantly, but their survival was rarely a solitary achievement. It was built upon borrowed loaves, shared fires, charitable donations, and prayers whispered in candlelit chapels. Without such bonds, the endless floods would have crushed the poorest long before reformers arrived to change the city. By the mid-19th century, London could no longer ignore the cost of its drowned streets and poisoned water. Repeated floods, coupled with devastating cholera outbreaks in 1832, 1848, 1854, and 1866, exposed a truth the authorities had long avoided. The city's infrastructure was collapsing under its own growth. The breaking point came in the summer of 1858, remembered as the Great Stink. The Thames, swollen with sewage and industrial waste, reeked so strongly that Parliament itself was nearly forced to abandon Westminster. Curtains soaked in chloride of lime were hung across windows, but nothing masked the stench. Suddenly, the misery that the poor had endured for decades could no longer be ignored by the powerful. Enter Joseph Bazalgette, chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works. Between 1859 and 1875, he led the construction of one of the greatest engineering projects of the century, a vast network of intercepting sewers designed to carry waste away from the Thames. Brick by brick, his system transformed London. Floodwaters were not eliminated, but the deadly mixing of sewage with drinking water was sharply reduced. Cholera, once thought unstoppable, retreated. For the wealthy, this was hailed as a triumph of modern science and engineering. For the poor, it meant fewer funerals, cleaner wells, and a new chance at life. Yet even with Bazalgette's sewers, low-lying districts along the riverbanks still suffered from seasonal floods. The reforms did not erase the hardships entirely, but they marked the first real turning point in London's long battle with its own waters. Yet even with progress, the memory of those years lingered. To understand the resilience of Victorians, we must step back and see the bigger picture, not just the engineering, but the human struggle that defined a generation. In the shadow of the Empire, Victorian London was not just a city of grandeur, but of survival. Families endured floods year after year, drinking beer instead of water, balancing on planks above rivers of sewage, and clinging to each other in candle-lit attics while the tide swallowed their streets. What seems unimaginable today was, for them, simply life. The resilience of Londoners is hard to overstate. They raised furniture on bricks, shared bread with neighbours, and carried on through the stench of death and disease. To live in Victorian London was to live in defiance of water itself, filthy, relentless, and often lethal. And yet from this suffering came transformation. The Great Stink, the cholera epidemics, the endless floods, together they forced change. Joseph Bazalgette's sewers and the sanitary reforms of the late 19th century stand as monuments not just to engineering, but to the will of a city to survive. Today, we turn on a tap without a thought. Clean water flows and floods rarely threaten our daily bread. But behind that simple luxury lies a history written in hardship, sacrifice, and human endurance. So next time it rains for 2 days straight, remember Victorian London. Remember the families who risked death for a sip of water, who waded through sewage to earn a wage, who prayed that the tide would finally turn, because history is not just about palaces and parliaments. It's about ordinary people, fighting to live another day. If you found this glimpse into their struggle eye-opening, make sure to subscribe for more untold stories of the Victorian age, where behind the lace and lamplight lies a world far darker and far more human than we often imagine.